Welcome to What's Your Story podcast. I'm your host, Matt Story. On this pod, I sit down with people of color leaders to understand how they've been able to use their superpowers to make an impact on our world. And I do it one story at a time. My guest on the pod this week is a professional storyteller, thought leader, and self-proclaimed freedom fighter with over 10 years of experience solving technology problems across engineering, legal, compliance, and regulatory spaces for global organizations. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about her story. So please welcome Alexandria Butler, aka Lexi B, to the show.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you for jumping on the mic and being willing to share your story with me. But before we get into learning more about your journey, I'm wondering if you could take us back and maybe share a story about what little Lexi B may have been like.
Little Lexi B is probably very similar to adult Lexi B, which can be a good or bad thing. But I have a really funny story that my dad always tells people. When I was around 5 or 6, my dad was in medical school. We were living, he was in residency, and we were living in New Orleans, and he had this dinner with very important people at the hospital. And for whatever reason, my mom, who's a teacher, an award-winning teacher, she has a very, very strong career. The schedules were not aligning, Matt. So I had to go to this dinner with my dad. And for that to happen, I know that my mom was doing something where it was like, I cannot make it work. For folks who are kids of teachers, you are very aware that teachers have these very insane schedules, but many times they can bring their kids with them because they are teachers. So the fact that my mother could not bring me is very interesting. So I had to go dinner with my dad. And so my dad's getting me dressed. He's combing my hair. And the whole time he's looking at me and he's like, do not say anything. Do not tell me that. This is not an opinionated evening. I need to keep my status in residency. And I think he low-key put the fear of God in me. So we get to this restaurant, this very fancy restaurant in New Orleans, and the food starts coming out. And for folks who are used to New Orleans, usually the first course is some kind of gumbo. And the gumbo comes out, and I'm just sitting there with like all of these men, and they're eating and they're talking and drinking their wine. And the head of the department looks at me and he says, "Why aren't you eating your gumbo?" And I just sit there because my father said, do not say anything. Do not have an opinion on anything. And for the record, little Lexi B was very opinionated and would say a lot of things. So I'm just like, I'm not responding to this man. And the guy looks at me again and asks me the question. And then my dad starts nudging my leg like, well, you need to respond. And I'm looking at him like, but you said not to respond. Like, this is a lot for a 5-year-old to handle. And so I looked at the guy and I was like, they only gave me 2 shrimp. So I don't want to eat it. And this man turned down the whole restaurant and was like, get this baby some shrimp. And according to my father, because of that, the guy started liking him in the residency program. Me and the guy got along very well at the dinner, talked about shrimp and like the foods that I liked. And that was the day that my dad realized that actually maybe my opinions can keep him employed. So yes. That was little Lexi B. I just, stomped on the haters at the restaurant for 2 hours talking about shrimp.
Yeah. And as the father of a 5-year-old, that story really rings home and I can relate.
You're like, do not mess this up. And you're like, wait, tap dance it. They like the tap dance it. And I think in that moment, my dad really realized like, oh, like she can put on a show. Right? Yeah. Now, don't ask her anything controversial. Like, don't ask her about politics because then, like, we may turn this whole place out. But shrimp, she can put on a show. So, yeah.
I'm curious. When you were growing up, and it sounds like you had a little bit of thoughts and perspectives on things, did you know what you wanted to be?
Yes and no. I had no idea what I wanted to be. I knew all the things that I did not want to be, which is a very interesting list. So, again, my dad's a doctor. I did not want to be a doctor. My mom's a teacher. I did not want to be in education. And I think it's a mix of being a child and being a child of 2 very hardworking, high-ranking people in their field. And so spending a lot of weekends watching them work in a childlike, ignorant manner and very innocent manner. I was like, well, I don't want to work this hard, right? Which is funny because now I work really hard. I think many times as a child, what you see, either A, you gravitate towards, like, I want to do that, right? Or you're like, I never want to do that. And so those are the two things. I was like, I don't want to be a doctor like my dad. I don't want to be in education like my mom. Even though that story about the shrimp was in St. Louis, when my dad finished residency, we moved back to St. Louis. I'm sorry, it was in New Orleans, but when my dad finished residency, we moved back to St. Louis. And so I was about 6 or 7. And I just knew that I wanted to get out of St. Louis. So that was my understanding. So no medicine, no education, to be a teacher in the education system and be out of St. Louis, Missouri. Those were the prerequisites.
So you describe yourself as a storyteller, and that really resonates with me because I think we all should be storytellers. And I think that it's truly what is a skill that can't be replaced. But I'm curious, like, at what point did you realize you were a storyteller?
I knew I was a storyteller very, very young because of my mother. So my mother, and as you can tell, both of my parents are very influential in my life. Mm-hmm. My mom heard me singing in the shower when I was about 5 or 6. And she was like, this little kid can carry a tune. And for background, my mother was a great singer and was raised in the church, so singing in the church, and was in all these plays. And so her mother really encouraged her to do theater and oration and things like that. And so my mom always says, like, I knew that you were opinionated and I knew that you could have a one-on-one conversation with people. I knew you could check people on facts and you would go to like your little encyclopedias at home. For the kids that don't know what that is, that's pre-internet. And there are these very large books that have information in them that I used to read. But I was singing in the shower in the bathroom and my mom was like, oh, she can carry a note. And so she took me to a choir audition in St. Louis for the St. Louis Symphony Children's Choir. I don't even know if they're still a thing. And so I started singing in this choir, which then turned into doing musical theater auditions and getting very entrenched in like regional musical theater and Broadway and auditions. And so at a very young age, I realized not only could I tell a story, but how in which I tell a story is the most impactful. And there are I think everyone can tell a story. Like sitting there and telling me a story is not hard. But what musical theater training taught me, and like vocal lessons and dance and the Nutcracker and all these things, were how in which you tell a story is actually the bag. Like that's the thing. Yeah. And I spent, since I was 6 years old, in a lot of training to not only learn how to tell stories in different mediums, but most importantly, to learn how to utilize my strengths in those mediums to get my point across. Yeah. Even before I was in college. Yes.
Well, what's interesting is you started by saying anyone can tell a story, which I don't think people believe that. I think a lot of people, they sometimes overemphasize facts. And it's like, even if you think about how we're raised, we go to school to memorize things. And it's like, oh, memorize the capitals of the states. Oh, I'm going to memorize the Pythagorean theorem. Oh, I'm going to memorize thing after thing after thing, as opposed to sitting down and being able to say, like, what is actually the reason behind this? What's the connecting context around this? And even as you think about how we introduce ourselves, I always, share with others that I could tell you I'm the VP of the thing of the thing of the thing. That doesn't really mean anything to most people. They may say, oh, that sounds impressive. I have no idea what that is. As opposed to saying, actually, I'm a dad. I'm a marketer. I'm a mama's boy. Like these type of things are really rare. So I'm curious, what would you tell someone that doesn't think they're a storyteller, how they could even get to that foundational level of telling a story? I'm not talking about the advanced stuff you were talking about, but like the foundational level of like, to be a storyteller, do this.
You need to read. You need to read storytellers. You need to read. And I think that's something that I forgot in my earlier statement. I take it for granted that I come from two people that are readers. My father's a doctor, but he majored in history, which is very weird. Most people don't realize that, right? So my mother and father are two individuals who not only are storytellers, but more importantly, see the value of storytelling. So I grew up in a house, even before I was in musical theater and before I was in dance and all these mediums, of two grown adults who made conscious storytelling a priority in our household. So whether it was them telling me stories, whether it was them requiring me to read books of fabulous storytellers, like I was reading James Baldwin at 5. I distinctly remember reading 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup at 7 or 8 years old. I remember, reading Where the Wild Fern Grows with my mom. And so my parents were very big on storytelling, and they really pushed that on me. But it wasn't this like, oh, she's born, let's talk about storytelling 101. It was like, we are going to immerse her with phenomenal storytellers, right? And we are going to require her to tell us what she loved about that story. And so I remember growing up, every time that I finished a book at the dinner table, it was like, well, did you like the book? And it was okay for me to not like the book as long as I had a reason for not liking the book. I remember growing up, and every night after bedtime and bath time, it was, what book are we reading? I remember my father like going to Borders, RIP Borders for the young ones. It's Borders was a fabulous place. Borders is pre-Barnes and Noble. And taking me to Borders on Saturday and buying me a new book so then we could go to his office and he could work and I had something to do. And so that's actually my requirement. If you want to be a fabulous storyteller, you need to start reading stories from fabulous storytellers and start dissecting why or why not you like how in which they do it.
Well, thank you for giving us this like parenting masterclass of how to raise conscious, educated storytellers. It's funny when you said that, it's so obvious, but it's so impactful that like, that's truly how you get to understand the art of telling a story. But you mentioned getting out of St. Louis was a goal. So you ended up selecting Stanford for your undergraduate studies. So I'm curious, like, what did you, I mean, obviously everyone has this idea of Stanford, but what did you specifically take away from your experience there?
I loved going to Stanford. I'm one of those people who's a diehard Stanford fan. I really enjoyed my college experience. It was the first time in my life. Well, let me take a step back. I, again, raised in St. Louis, Missouri, which is a very diverse city for the record. But when it comes to education and when it comes to religion, it is very divisive, right? So St. Louis has all these white private schools with little sprinkles of diversity. And I'm not just talking about Black kids. I'm talking about any color that is not white. You have a little sprinklage, right? A little morsel over here. And my mom taught at one of these all-white private schools, and I went to one of these all-white private schools. And then on the weekends, I was hanging out with my friends from church. And St. Louis is very divisive when it comes to religion. So if you are the color blue, you go to the blue church on Sundays. And if you're the color green, you go to the green church on Sundays. So I went to a Black church. And so my life was very polarizing in that. When it was time to go to college, I was like, I want to have Black people around me, not only on Saturday. And that was a very, very big thing for me. And my parents also understood that because my parents had a very similar upbringing. They went to all white private schools in St. Louis as well. And then they chose more diverse colleges. So that was the thing. And when I went to Stanford, that's definitely what I got. It was just eye-opening to see all of these people. And again, as a storyteller, I was like, I just want to know all of your stories. I want to know why we're here, how we got here. I want to know how your grandpa got here. Like, teach me everything. I always tell people, and this may be a bad thing, but I learned more at Stanford outside the classroom than inside the classroom. It was almost as if the inside of classroom was the prerequisite for me to be able to stay and hang out on campus. But it was having a South Korean freshman roommate from South Korea. It was meeting all of these people from all over the world. It was having waffles with them in the morning and learning about how they were raised and do they like that or not. Stanford was the first place from a diaspora standpoint that I had been around so many Black people that were not Black American. And as a kid who was encouraged to be immersed in stories, I knew there were Black people all over the world. I knew there were Black people in Brazil, and there were Black people in Trinidad. And obviously there were Black people in the motherland of Africa, and there were Black people in Europe. But coming from St. Louis, I didn't have a lot of those representations in person. So to go to Stanford and be like, so wait a minute. So you're from Ghana, you're from Nigeria, you're from Kenya, you're from Germany, you're from Brazil, you're Black Peruvian, your dad's from Trinidad, you're from Jamaica. Like, it was amazing to me to be a part of that and to be immersed in that. and really grow and redefine for me what Blackness is. And I think at the time, I did not realize how important that is. And now I'm a parent to, as I call, a Black bougie magical fairy, but she is in the shape of a little Black girl. And so to give her these stories and be able to give her these nuggets and really expand her mind of how she defines her own Blackness, that really stemmed from Stanford for me.
It's interesting because I think a lot about, well, as a parent, but also just as like a curious person, I think a lot about college and how it's going to need to evolve. And I think that I too, like you, most of the things I took away from school, and I actually went to school in St. Louis at WashU, so I'm familiar. It was outside of the class. Like I couldn't tell you anything about a class I was at this point, but it's like the relationships, it's the conversations, it's the contextual things that I was exposed to that I'd never been exposed to that still sit with me today. And like, that's the piece that I just worry that we put so much pressure on kids to go to school, to get good grades, to get a good job. And it's like, we really don't think about like those contextual, just being in the room with someone that, to your point, is from a different part of the world or has grown up in a different way. That's truly the education. That's truly what you're paying all that money for, is to put them in that environment. And I think a lot about like, how do you get some of that earlier? Because again, like there's things that I learned in college I probably should have known before I turned 18, 19 years old. But then also too, like, you know, what is it going to change? But again, that's a bit of a rabbit hole that I often go down in my own thoughts and just thinking about where things are going.
Yeah.
I want to jump into your professional journey. And so again, I always like to use people's words because it tells me a lot about how you describe your story. I think there's always something under it. So your website says that you accidentally landed in Silicon Valley. So I'd love to understand, because most folks want to land in Silicon Valley, but you say accidentally. What does that mean? How did that happen for you? What caused that accident?
It was very literal. I, again, came to Stanford. You know, when you know, that summer before going to college is a very transformative summer. It's a very fun summer. It's a very exciting summer. Probably sprinkle in a little anxiety because of the unknown. And so everyone's like, oh, you're going to Stanford. What are you going to do? And again, I had my list of all the things that I did not want to do. At the time at 18, I was leaning towards this more creative thing. So in my head, I was like, I want to work in business, but I want to do creative, sexy things in business. Like I want to produce the Pepsi Super Bowl commercial. So whoever does that, that's what I want to do, right? I want to do the business side of a fashion house. Like I did not know what I wanted to do, but I just was like, I want to be in the creative side of business. Coming from St. Louis, that meant marketing or PR. So I get to Stanford, I said, I'm going into marketing PR. That's what we're doing. And for folks who know me, Matt, I am a goal-oriented person, okay? So don't, like when we decide the goal and we have established, okay? That's what we're doing. And it's very hard for me to deviate, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. So then I get to Stanford and I'm about to date myself, but I was in high school when Facebook started. I remember when Facebook was a thing and you could only get on Facebook if you had a college EDU. Okay. When I finished high school, it was just when Facebook said everybody can come. So I remember going to Stanford for admit weekend, which is, you know, this weekend for the prospective freshmen to come. And I think I'm still Facebook friends with many of these kids that I met in admit weekend who actually didn't end up going to Stanford, right? But blessings to them. They chose different things. I'm now on the internet. Facebook was really the first time that I was on the internet. I remember I was the first class from the Common Application that had an application on the internet, and it was a big deal. So like, that's how old I am. In high school, it was a big deal because it was like, now these kids get to do it on the internet, right? I have friends who I went to Stanford with that were upperclassmen when I was a freshman that are like, oh, I had to like fill mine out and put in the mail. So I am part of that class of like, Facebook was our first understanding of what the internet could really do as far as connecting people. Before that, it was like, oh, the internet exists. Do not use Wikipedia for your 5-page essay. But Facebook was the first time where it was like, so I can talk to Matt from across the world on the internet? What?
Mm-hmm.
And then I go to a school like Stanford, which is very well known for their computer science department. So I get on campus, I meet all these like beautiful and talented and sexy, nerdy computer science kids who were like, I'm working at a startup this, startup this, startup this, startup this. And I distinctly remember I was like, you know what? I want to be unique. And that sounds horrible, but I was like, I want to be unique. So I'm not going to be a doctor. I do not want to be a lawyer. And I do not want to work for a startup. When I go to breakfast, I want to say something different. But of course, I'm at Stanford. So I did all of these internships to prepare me for fashion PR. I received job offers for that. And I realized that I did not want to do them. And I remember calling my parents my senior year, like, I don't want to do any of these things. My life is over. I have nothing to show for it. And they were like, look, you have 9 months to figure this out. They were like, we support the journey. But when we come to college graduation in 9 months, I'm going to, my dad was like, I'm going to ask you, what are we doing? And you need to have a response. So like, figure that out. Right. I had a friend, like real talk. I had a friend who interned at this company at NetApp, and she sent out an email to some email list that I was on. And she was like, hey, the company that I worked for, they're looking for someone to come join the company full time. I can't because I have 1 more year of college left. If you would like to interview for this role, hit me up. And I responded, this is spring break senior year. And I was like, I don't know what this is, but as long as the prerequisite is not, I have to be an engineer, let's go. And so we met for coffee, and she was like, look, you don't have to be an engineer, but you're very smart and you just need to communicate, and you're very good at communicating. And I was like, bet. So I went to the interview, and to be very transparent, I am a product of grace. There was a man, his name is Kirk Law. We're still in contact today. He was the director of engineering for the department. My boss worked for Kirk Law. And I remember he walked in the room in the interview, and he looked at me and he was like, you have no idea what you're doing, do you? And I was like, if I tell the truth, will I get the job? He laughed, and he never responded to that question. He was just like, how do you communicate with people? Tell me a time that you solved a hard problem. Right. And I answered them, and he just looked at me and he said, as he left the room, he was like, if you make it through this interview, you're going to be good. And so I got through the interview. The woman at the time, like real talk, y'all, the woman who was my boss, we bonded over shoes. I am a shoe girly. She's a shoe girly. I think a lot of my interview feedback were like, she has no idea what she's doing, but she's eager and she's smart and she communicates very well, which, to be frank with you, are the great attributes of a great program manager. I just did not know it. And that's how I got my first job in tech. I thought I would do it for a year as I figured out how to get back to New York and get back in the fashion game. And 14, 15 years later, I'm still here. So yeah, I accidentally got in. My parents said, do not have us roll up to Stanford, California in Palo Alto at graduation. And when these other parents say, so what is Lexi doing? My dad was like, do not have me looking stupid. Okay. So figure that out. And so I figured it out. I got this job. And then every day since, I've just been figuring it out.
There's so many things in that I love. So one, I truly believe in this world of technology and AI and the like, that we all have to think about transferable skills. So
Yes.
the fact that you really focus in and honed in on like, hey, communicating is something that I can do in spades, and I don't necessarily need to know the content, but I can connect with people and I can understand what they're trying to do, and I can make those connections that aren't just based on my expertise, but based on who they are, who I am. I think that's going to help anyone in any field do anything. And I think that, realizing that the subject matter you could get up to speed with, you could understand it because you were a hard worker, you were someone that could show up and do those things. I think the other thing that is evident, and you use it in the setup of your story, but what was happening contextually around you. So how the world was changing and how you took advantage of how the world was changing. Because it's funny you describe yourself of a certain age, because I'm a little bit older than you. So I remember that more distinctly, but I was actually working when the internet boomed, and there was this shift where basically traditional marketers didn't know anything about it because they hadn't been trained in it. But those of us that were growing up and using these things and using AOL Instant Messenger and using, Yahoo and all these things, we weren't necessarily classically trained marketers, but we understood the internet. And I understood like, oh, if you want to connect with people, to your point, it's actually breaking this way. And this is how you can do it. And that was like my way to enter a space that I had no expertise in, but I was doing it as a consumer. And so it gave me a leg up. And I think about kids today, I'll call them kids, it might be a little bit older, but the way that they're natively in these spaces, like they have to use that to their advantage.
Were you of the Black Planet era?
Yes.
Okay.
Black Planet was definitely.
Because we do need to shout out Black Planet. I do want to make it clear, like if there was no Black Planet, there'd be no Facebook. Now,
no Facebook.
As this Black kid growing up in the suburbs, I was not on Black Planet. And if I even knew what it was, my parents, knowing them, wouldn't let me be on Black Planet at 10 or 12. But we do need to shout out Black Planet. And you're right, is that these kids these days, they're using the stuff. So to them, this accidental, I got into this thing accidentally. It's like, no, I use it every day. Right. And my story is like, I wasn't using this stuff. Right. I'm a 90s kid. We went out and played until the lights went down on the weekends, on Saturdays. Right. Nickelodeon was our thing. So as a child growing up, if you came to me and said, I'm an executive at Nickelodeon, I know exactly what that is. If you were like, I work with Bill Gates at Microsoft, and that affects me how? That affects me how? So it was really Facebook for me that really brought me into the internet space, because it was the first time that I was a consumer of this technological shift that was going on in the world. And then imagine you have that. And then you go to Stanford, where I remember my friends and I would bike past the Facebook office because of just like the proximity we were to all of these booms. I remember when Instagram was created, right? In a Stanford classroom. And so now I'm a consumer of technology, and it's booming literally down the street from my dorm. And then all that coming together, it was like, I just kind of accidentally stumbled into this.
I do want to understand, because you've worked at a number of like globally recognized companies, Airbnb, Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft. But what have you taken away from those experiences? And like, what would be something that maybe somebody listening would be surprised to know as you've collected? Because let me give you a little bit of context. I think we can sometimes look at someone's LinkedIn, which I did for you, and be just blown away. And like, because you look at the badge value, it's like, wow, you went to Stanford. Wow, you worked at Airbnb. Wow, you worked at Twitter. You worked at like these places. But I think that really what's interesting again is what's under that. And like, what did you either learn about yourself, or what surprised you about being in those rooms, that somebody that hasn't had the opportunity to be there would be surprised to know?
A few things. One, I think that there's always a misconception with my resume. That I'm now learning. So I'm actively trying to be debunked when I have a microphone. I've had so many people come to me, Matt, say, it's so amazing that you have, strategically gone to all of these very large consumer brands. Like as if I woke up one day at 23 and said, this is where I'm going to work. Consumer brand, $1 billion only. And I will say that I'm not dumb. So I'm aware of the badges that it gives me. I'm not dumb. But that was never the goal. It was never the goal. How it happened like that, y'all need to look at God and the blood and ancestry of Harriet Tubman. That was not the goal. I do not go searching, collecting consumer-based companies like Affinity Stones. I do go search and collect great managers. And it just so happens that search has led me to these companies. I do not work for companies. I work for managers. So that's the first thing. And so when you look at my journey, and every time that I talk about it in crazy detail, the stories are literally like, I wanted to go work for that person, and or I wanted to go work on that thing. That's my career story. Because every company that I've worked at, I've literally worked on something different, a different subject matter. because I do use my transferable skills for a lot of things. I am not an engineer. I will not do a coding review for you. My paycheck says that I'm not engineer. If I was an engineer, I am grossly underpaid. Okay. So that's not me. So I'm literally getting jobs because of my transferable skills. We're going to call a spade a spade. I'm looking for different trends in the technology industry. I'm saying like, oh, I can see that be a really big topic in the next 3 years, or a really thorn in someone's spine in the next 3 years, AKA there will be money resource to that thing. And I think that topic is kind of cool. I want to work in that thing. Or it's, I want to work for you. Mm-hmm. So if we're at Walgreens bagging chapstick, just tell me what the address is. I'll see you on Market and Fifth. Mm-hmm. If we are at Microsoft doing AI security, just give me the address. I'll be there at 9 a.m. Also, like, what kind, do you want cream or oat milk in your coffee? I can also bring that too. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think that's a very big misconception. And the last thing I think is that people who are not in the tech industry, I think that they assume that these people are extremely smart. And for the record, there are a lot of very extremely smart people that I work with, and I'm so honored to work with on a lot of problems I solve. I've also met a lot of people that is not the case for them, and mediocrity is very real. And especially when we're talking to audiences of where you and I both come from, I want to make that very clear. That people who work in tech, this is not some superhero syndrome. This is not some, they are one in a needle in a haystack. Anyone can work in this industry. You just have to have the drive, and you have to have the opportunity, which we don't talk about enough. And you have to be curious. You have to want to learn the things, because fun fact, as you and I both know, tech changes every other day. So if we're going to sit here and say, in order for you to work in AI, you have to be an AI expert. Matt, AI experts happened yesterday.
Yeah.
The people who started AI and started really talking about this AI thing, one, we're doing it about 20 years ago under the table. But two, when the conversation came up, they weren't experts. They were just like, has anybody ever thought about this like one thing? Because like I saw iRobot yesterday, and like that could actually like be a thing.
Work.
Right? Yeah. Like that's really how this works. And so the next wave of technology, whatever it is, it's happening right now in someone's garage. There's someone who sees a movie or thinks about it or met an alien on the street on Saturday night and is like, wait. But like we could do that. Mm-hmm. And I want everyone to know that is that this is not some like, well, they're an expert and they're a rocket scientist. It literally is people who are very curious about things and just start digging and just start playing, and people who have the encouragement of others and the opportunity to dig and play, which means that you are not lacking in any capacity to be in the tech industry. You may be missing the opportunity, you may be missing the connections, but as far as your brain and how it works and your ideas, whoever told you that that's lacking is a lie.
I want to double down on that, because I think where you started, and it's like really focusing in on, you didn't set out to say, I'm going to work at A, B, C, and D. No. You were doing two things. You were following people that were good people and you felt you could learn from, and you were following your curiosity.
Yeah.
And I think those are two, that's how you build a career. That's like, regardless of what industry you're in, if you can find the right people that you're going to learn from, and they're going to, support you and provide space for you to grow. And then also if you can be curious, because I often tell people it's not about having the right answer.
No.
Because there's only so many answers that you can know. It's about asking the right question that's going to get you to the right answer. And I think we can sometimes, and again, people from our background can feel like we have to have the right answer. And I have to know everything going into the room. And I'm not going to go into the room until I know everything. And to your point, there's no way to know everything about these spaces that literally I describe as like the ground is moving under us.
Yes.
So if you're standing still, you're actually losing ground. You're actually falling back by just standing still. So every day I have the choice of, am I going to move forward or am I going to go backwards? There's no staying where I am. And I think asking questions has been something that I've tried, again, why I do a podcast, why you do a podcast, is why I've tried to hone that, because I think that truly can help you understand where things are going. It can help you understand where answers may be. Even if I don't have them, I can understand it's over in that corner. We should go look and we should explore. Because I think a lot of times if you try to always have the answer, you're going to come up short.
I agree. And I also think that people don't realize, I was talking to a mentee a few days ago and I told her, I said, the number of times that I literally say IDK in meetings, and you could see her face, and she's a very young Black woman, and she was like, you can do that? And I was like, sometimes I think I get paid to say, I don't know. Right? Because guess what? One, I don't. Right? I always tell people one of my superpowers at work is that I will be very candid with you. Don't ask me a question you don't want the answer to. Okay? And so if you ask me a question at work and I genuinely do not know the answer, I am very confident enough in my skill to look at you and say, I have no idea. And I think you should go talk to this person about that because that's not my tax bracket. Or that is something that my team should explore. Let me get back to you. And I do not think that we discuss that enough and loudly enough in our communities. I don't know is an appropriate answer. Now, I don't know, period, not an appropriate answer. But you saying I don't know, but I'm willing to go explore, I'm willing to be in this room and get in the weeds with you to find the answer, great. The issue, I think historically, as you know, comes from you have to be 3 times as good to get half of what these people have. And I've done a lot of therapy work to really work through that. Of, do I think that I do have to be better in rooms? Of course, because racism is still rampant. Racism is still real. And to be frank, until capitalism is disbanded, it will always be there. But am I confident in my skill set to be able to publicly acknowledge that, no, I do not know something right now, and I'm so excited to go figure that out? Yes.
That addition of, and I will go figure out, because you don't want to say I don't know twice on the same thing. You don't want to be that person. You have to.
We're not going to do today. What we are not going to do in these billable hours is that. But showing that vulnerability, especially in the field that we work in, as you said, the ground is moving underneath us. So the fact that I'll be frank with you, I would actually be very concerned if someone walked into many of my meetings saying, I know. I wouldn't believe you.
Yeah. There's no way. So, speaking of, you mentioned a mentee, and so tell me about Sister Circle and Black Women in Tech, and what led you to start that? Because again, as I started doing the numbers, you've been doing this for 7 years, and so you were ahead of, I would say, the country on social reckoning. And so I'm curious, what led you to start it, and tell us a little bit about where it's going and where it's been.
Very selfishly, I was at Airbnb. And I was working on, again, very hard problems. So again, in the room all the time, I don't know. So when I was at Airbnb, I was hired as a compliance project manager. To this day, I don't know what that means. Don't ask me, Matt. I don't know. But I was working at this startup. It was, this is 2016, 2017. So Airbnb was this, at that time, was this very hot startup. PR everywhere, as you remember. And it only had, I think I was maybe person number 2,000 or right under 2,000. Yeah. So you have less than 2,000 people working on this machine that everyone is talking about. And it's all over the news in the best way. And it just so happened that right as I got there, the hashtag Airbnb while Black went viral, which was people using Airbnbs and then being discriminated against because they are Black and then talking about it on Twitter. So not only now do we have a safety issue, because as you and I both know, discrimination is a spectrum. It can come from a person looking at you weird, to a person saying a mean thing, to you literally being murdered, right? So not only was it a safety issue as an Airbnb company, we have to keep our people safe who use our platform, but now it's the internet talking about the safety issue. And so now it's the churn of oh, this is bad. Right. And I just happened to be there, and I was new, and my manager who was there, who was phenomenal, she had all of these phenomenal relationships in the company. So she had built this wonderful brand at Airbnb of getting things done. So when this happens, the head of legal goes to her and says, hey, figure this out. And she comes to me and she's like, hey, come to this meeting. And within 6 weeks at the company, I'm in these meetings with the CEO and the head of policy and the head of trust and safety of having these hard conversations of so what happens if someone's discriminated against? What happens if someone's physically assaulted? What happens if we have sex trafficking? What happens if we have drugs? And, me in my 20s, I was like, this sounds like Law and Order SVU in the best way. Someone call Olivia Benson. Like, I'm in it. I'm in it to win it. I have seen all the episodes. Olivia and Elliot have prepared me for this moment. Thank you, cable TV. Right? Thank you, cable TV. Like, I have made it to Mecca. This is amazing. And I loved it. And so I spent almost 2 years just like literally having these very thought-provoking theory conversations and saying, how do you take theory into practice? So I'm in these rooms with these leaders. And what happened was, as a dark-skinned Black woman, I am very aware that how in which I show up to work, how in which I communicate, and how in which I tell people stuff is received differently because of who I am and what I look like. Versus another person who might be a white, straight passing man, and he can come up into a room and he can yell and he can shout and he can cuss you out and call you everything but a child of God. And then how that is received is he's mean, but he was passionate. It was a bad day. I cannot do that. But I'm still in rooms with leaders and I have to make them accountable and hold them accountable for the things they say they would do. And so there was a man at the company who was a white man. And after a meeting one day, he pulled me aside and he was like, look, he said, I'm going to say something and I hope you take it the right way, which of course you're already on edge, right? Yep. And he was like, you need to figure out how you are going to hold these leaders accountable because you are walking into that room and you are allowing them to step all over you. So last week you said this is the due date and we go to this meeting and the stuff's not done. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, but the difference is that you can walk in the room and you can yell at everybody and you're going to keep your job. I can't do that. And he looked at me and he said, I hear you. And I'm telling you that if you don't figure out how to do this to keep your job, you're going to lose your job. And so I took that home. I thought about it and I said, I'm going to need Black women in my life to teach me how to do this. Because as outlandish as what that man told me, he's in fact right. If I'm in these rooms, and that's my job as a program manager. How is this going on? Why is this not done? I need this by 5. If I don't feel comfortable holding the leader of XYZ department accountable for that, I actually will lose my job. But I cannot walk in a meeting and professionally cuss out the head of legal. Yeah. So where is that balance? And so I started this group. And I remember my first post where I actually wrote about this in my first post. And at the end of it, I said, anybody want to grab some overpriced eggs on Saturday and talk about this? I'll bring my pen and pencil. I need to learn how to do this. And then from that, people just started coming to brunch with me and they started going to Soul Cycle with me. And then we started grabbing smoothies. And then over time, within the first year, it was like 1,000 people all over the world. And then I remember Instagram found out about it and they were like, we want to do an event. And I was like, great. I'm actually interviewing at Facebook right now. Is that a problem? And they were like, no, that makes it even easier. So I joined Facebook with our first partnership on paper contracted. And so I'm going to Facebook. I'm working in my first 90 days, going to meetings, as well as then meeting the heads of Instagram at lunch to talk about this partnership. And it just blossomed. And so now we have over, I think almost 20,000 people all over the world. We do not meet physically as much formally, but a lot of the women do meet, in their own little quarters. And it really is about how do we help people? How do we connect? How do we make sure Black women have the resources they need to do their job well? I would argue not only in tech, but in the corporate world, because what is tech at this point? I think tech is everywhere, but then also like Black women feel very comfortable having conversations that we would not have in the outside world. So a good example was last night, there was this huge post and great conversation around a woman who said, look, I'm tired of not getting promoted. I deserve these promotions. Why is it not happening? And to see the comments of people saying, oh, we need to have a deeper conversation about self-worth and promotions and why that's all tied together. And I'm like, see, like we're not having these conversations in the community. And I think it's a place where we can all do that. So we can have these conversations. We can have safe spaces. We can be ourselves in many ways that Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 p.m. we cannot. And then we can grow and learn from each other. Each one teach one.
I love it. I love everything about it. I think you're 100% right that because what sounds like in that conversation you have with that person is two things can be true. It can be true that you know where the limits of what you can and can't say are, but at the same time, you're going to be held to a standard that you need to deliver against. And you need people that have been in that position and have been able to look at that challenge from your perspective. And no matter how, a manager, a boss, a skip level, no matter how they can think about it, if they haven't sat and walked into your shoes, it's very difficult for them to give you actionable advice on how you could go about it. And so I think having those people you can tap and go into and say, hey, let's dig into this. I think is truly powerful.
And I think that's one of my superpowers. I don't really, I don't know. It gives me sometimes a little bit of anxiety to talk about my superpowers unless I'm in an interview, because that's negotiation. Like, I'm not the one. Okay. But what I'm learning in my career that I think that I've had for a very long time, I didn't realize it, is I'm very open to feedback. And I think that actually comes from musical theater. When you are 10 years old and you're at an audition and you are told you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too tall, you're too short, like you got the dance moves down, but you just can't be in this lineup because you're too dark skinned. So at a very young age, I've received a lot of feedback that is hurtful, that is beautiful, like the whole spectrum. And so the one thing when I started my career was, in my head, I was like, there's not a lot y'all can't tell me that I haven't heard.
Yeah.
And I still survived it. And it's going to be hurtful. Like, feelings are valid, but I still survived it. And I've always been in my career very able to sit there and take the feedback, even if I disagree with it, even if I find it extremely oppressive and extremely obnoxious, and react in a way where I'm not cussing you out, right? And I think that people have told me that they feel very comfortable telling me the truth. Yeah. And sometimes that's a bad thing, man. I've heard some things. But like in this scenario with Airbnb, I didn't ask that man for that information. We left a meeting where I assumed that my behavior was like, I'm not going to sit here and tell, the chief people officer that they're wrong. And I remember, like, we left the meeting and he looked at me as we're walking out the door and he was like, do you have 5 minutes? And we went into a conference room and he just told me just like that. And his point was, he was like, I hope you don't take me to HR for this, but like, you need to figure this out. Yeah. Because what just happened in that room cannot happen. And if this is your job, you need to do your job. And currently you're not doing it. You need to figure this out. And I'm actually very grateful for that, because guess what? If he had never said that, I would have never figured it out. I would have been in my feet. I would have been inside of me like, I can't tell so-and-so that. Yeah. And I could have lost my job. So I appreciate that feedback.
What's fascinating about that is, like, going back to your thing about, associating promotion with self-worth, and like just the psyche of what you and I probably carry into the corporate world. Yeah. Is, I think about it as like, we almost look at it as like free throw shooting. I'm gonna make a sports analogy. I know it's probably not great, but like, I got to hit 100% of free throws. Like, I can't miss. Like, these are free. These are like, no one's guarding me. Like that's our perspective. Whereas other people have more of a baseball analogy of like, I only got to hit, 1 out of 4 of these, I got to knock out of the park. Everything I can miss. I can actually miss, strike out, and I'll get another chance. And I think that, like, we need to think about, like, how much of that is actually true and valid, and how much of that do we put on ourselves? Because I think we can a lot of times put extra pressure that we need to show up and show out that maybe not be there. And so finding that gray area where it's like, where's the reality and where's my perception, and where's that line, Phil? Because I think a lot of times that can become skewed, and again, it makes it very hard on you. But I did want to jump to your podcast, because I'm always fascinated by other podcast hosts and how they have stayed in the game and how they continue to innovate as this platform changes. So I'm curious, like, how do you balance wearing another hat of being a podcast host, and like, why is that so important for you to do it?
Balance is not a thing in my life. Balance has never been a thing. So I do want to shout out my tribe. I want to shout out my husband, and I want to shout out my mom, who, without my mom, I don't even know how my little fairy down the hall would be so amazing and blossoming. Like, you have to have help, and you as a parent as well. When you become a parent, when that kid comes in the house, things change. And so the priority is that kid. So I could not add this podcast to it without these people in my life that are like, we got you and we got you. And I do want to make that very clear. I started the podcast because I always receive so many questions on LinkedIn and just out and about in professional spaces of like, they're always like, Lexi, what is your biggest lesson? Right? Like, how can you teach us this lesson? And I always tell people, you know, the lessons that have actually catapulted my career, the lessons that have made lasting effects like this one from Airbnb, it's because someone pulled me in a room and told me. It wasn't in a textbook. It wasn't in a learning and development class, right? Like, we can use that example from Airbnb. He would have never said that publicly, right? But the fact that that happened so long ago, and to this day, I remember it like it was yesterday because of what happened from it, right? That's an impactful lesson. And so I wanted to create a space of like, how can we scale these lessons? Because all the lessons that have made me who I am in my career in a professional setting are because of that happy hour. It's because of that coffee. It's because of someone after a meeting saying, you know what, come here real quick. That's not going to work. That's not going to work, right? It's because of people like Kirk Law who come into an interview room, shut the door, and they're like, you have no idea what you're doing, do you? Okay. They're going to do, right? No one's going to publicly have those conversations with you, right? It's because there have been people in my life where I've gone into a conference room and stood in the back, and then they have said things like, do you want to do lunch so I can tell you what really happened? Like, they said this happened. That's not what happened. This happened. And so you need to cater your behavior to this part. Forget what they said, right? And that's the purpose of the podcast. So I invite leaders from all around the world. And even in our email conversations to prep for the episode, I say, what lesson do you want to talk about? I want you to pick a lesson that has really transformed your life, professional or personal. And we're going to talk about how you had to learn that lesson and how do we teach people about that lesson. And I always use personal and professional because I'm tired of people separating those things. They go together, especially when you're talking about who you decide to actively build a family with. If you want to build a family or if you want to have a life partnership, like, those personal decisions directly affect your bag. So that's what we're doing on this podcast. And it's currently on YouTube, season 3. It's just very exciting. And it's also, you know, in a cheesy way, it's also my way of giving back to all of these people that have poured into me and that still pour into me. Many of our guests are people that have taught me lessons, and they know that. So to be able to give these people their flowers while they are alive, while they can smell them, to be able to be on a public platform that I created and literally say like, yo, you taught me this lesson. Like, I would not be here if it wasn't for that lesson that you taught me, brings me so much joy.
Listen, I had way many more questions that we're not going to get to, but it's been amazing getting to hear your story and learn from your lessons through your story. But before I let you go, if people want to follow, they want to see what you're up to, where should I send them?
Send them to LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as Lexi B. Also, you can send them to YouTube. If you type in Lexi B or sit with Lexi B, that's where the podcast is. And then lastly, my website, which is www.lexib.com. Like to keep it very simple. I am there as well. But thank you so much for having me. And also, before we end, I want to honor you and thank you for having this platform. Because to create a platform is a lot of work, as I know. So I do want to honor that. Sustaining it is a lot of work. And what you're doing and how you're bringing people together is very, very important.
That was a really fun conversation with Lexi B. As you can see, she's definitely a vibe. And I just really love the fact that she's been curious and she's followed her curiosity throughout her career, but she's also remained true to who she was, even as that little girl at that dinner with her dad. And so it's really cool to kind of see how those two things have played out well for her. But the 3 things I'll take away from our conversation are: 1, she talked about that success usually comes when you're curious, but you also go and dig and play and figure out what's behind that curiosity, which again, I think as children, we get a lot of time to play and to discover. But as we get older, we think we're supposed to be serious and we think we're supposed to know what we are looking for, know what we're supposed to do, and not allowing ourselves to have that opportunity to actually get in there and play with things, I think is really key to being successful and finding those superpowers. The second thing she talked about is, and again, it may seem obvious, but I think sometimes we don't realize that this truly is an option for us, is that I don't know is an appropriate answer, and realizing that it's going to be nearly impossible for you to always have the answer to every question. And if you do, that might actually be a sign that you actually don't know what you're talking about. And I think the fact of being able to say, I don't know, but also being able to go and figure out what that answer is, or what is potentially a solution to the question that was posed. And then lastly, I firmly believe this, and she said this very well, but the fact that personal and professional decisions go hand in hand together. It's nearly impossible to separate your personal life from your professional life, because they're so intertwined into who you are, and they impact you in major ways. So as you think about whatever's impacting you personally is going to show up in your professional journey, and vice versa. So trying to separate those is actually going to create more tension, more friction for you. And just realizing that those actual decisions you're making in one facet of life is actually going to have an impact and have a ripple effect into the other facets. And so just accepting that and understanding that and being able to work through that, I think was a great advice. Until next time, I encourage you, as always, to continue to share your story. It's so important, not only for you, but for others to hear your story. And if you have any feedback or any comments about any of the podcasts, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at all of the social channels at Matt E. Story, or you can go to my website, www.mattestory.com.